Darth Revan is one of those characters who instantly earns the title of badass and radiates charisma that makes you wish he had his own movie. It is generally accepted that he was born around 3994 BBY and was discovered to be Force-sensitive at a young age. Some sources suggest he hailed from the Outer Rim territories, but this remains speculative. The Jedi Order spotted his potential early, and in this era, when the Order was thriving and full of recruits, standing out was no small feat. Revan wasn't the type of Jedi kid who blended into the background. Even as a youngling, he had this mix of curiosity and confidence that made him impossible to ignore. He soaked up lessons faster than his instructors could throw them at him. Philosophy, lightsaber combat, history, whatever the subject, he excelled. He had the kind of charisma that pulled people in. Other young Jedi wanted to follow him, even before he officially became a leader. The Jedi Temple on Coruscant was a massive place, filled with thousands of students and masters. Imagine a cross between a monastery, a university, and a military academy, all rolled into one. In that environment, it's easy to get lost. But Revan made a name for himself almost instantly. He wasn't arrogant, at least not yet, but he had that spark of genius that made his teachers both proud and nervous. Proud because he represented the best of what the Jedi could produce. Nervous because geniuses have a habit of bending the rules. Revan studied everything. He wasn't content to stick with the basic Jedi curriculum. He dug deep into Jedi history, learning about old conflicts, ancient Sith lords, forgotten wars. He asked questions other students didn't. Questions like, why did the Sith keep coming back? Why didn't the Jedi finish them for good? Why do we keep repeating the same mistakes? These weren't the kinds of questions the Council liked hearing from a teenager. But for Revan, understanding the past was the only way to prepare for the future. Lightsaber combat came just as naturally to him as philosophy. He mastered forms quickly, and while many Jedi specialized in one or two styles, Revan absorbed them all. He had a strategic mind that let him predict opponents, adapt mid-duel, and teach others how to improve. If someone struggled, Revan was the first to step in and explain, to guide them through. He wasn't content to be great alone. He lifted others with him, but let's be honest, charisma can be a double-edged vibroblade. People followed Revan because he was brilliant and inspiring, but that kind of influence is exactly what makes the Jedi Council wary. The Jedi ideal is humility, discipline, blending into the collective. Revan had all those qualities, but he also had the makings of a leader, someone others would rally behind instinctively. To the Council, that was both a gift and a risk. History had taught them what happens when a Jedi with too much charisma and too much curiosity goes off the rails. And spoiler, they weren't wrong to be nervous. Still, during these early years, Revan wasn't the Dark Lord he'd become. He was a bright star in the Order's sky, admired by his peers and respected by his masters. He carried himself with confidence, but not arrogance. He was bold but not reckless, and more importantly, he had a sense of empathy that kept him grounded. Students trusted him because he genuinely cared. Teachers challenged him because he could handle it. The exact details of his master or training assignments are fuzzy in the records, but what's clear is that he traveled widely even as a young Jedi. He studied on different worlds, learning not only from Jedi archives, but from the cultures of the galaxy. That exposure broadened his worldview and sharpened his mind. He wasn't the type to sit in the temple library forever. He wanted to see the galaxy firsthand, to understand the people the Jedi claimed to protect. It's easy, in hindsight, to see all the seeds of Revan's future in these early years. The hunger for knowledge, the questioning of authority, the ability to inspire loyalty. These were all there from the start. But at this point in the story, it wasn't ambition. It was brilliance, pure and simple. He was a prodigy in every sense of the word. Think of Revan as that student everyone remembers from school. The one who was smart, athletic, popular, and somehow still approachable. The one you either wanted to be friends with or wanted to compete against. That was Revan in the Jedi Order. He wasn't perfect, but he was unforgettable. And when history started moving toward chaos, he was the natural figure people looked to. To truly understand how Revan would rise, we first need to look at the galaxy before him, the Old Republic. The Republic at this time was massive. Like, we need 1,000 star maps just to find the capital. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. Think of it like the world's biggest HOA, but instead of telling you what color you can paint your fence, they're managing hyperspace lanes. trade disputes, and the occasional warlord trying to conquer a planet. The Galactic Senate was the center of it all, with endless debates, committees, and the usual politics that made people want to fall asleep mid-speech. But despite the bureaucracy, the Republic was stable. Civilizations were thriving, trade was flowing, and people could actually believe that peace was normal. At the heart of this system stood the Jedi Order, and at this point in history, the Jedi weren't scrambling to rebuild themselves or licking their wounds from past failures. They were everywhere, strong and respected. They had temples across the galaxy, thousands of members, and the reputation of being both warrior monks and wise philosophers. If you lived in this era, and pirates were raiding your shipping lanes, calling the Jedi wasn't some rare miracle. It was more like, let me check if we can get a Jedi strike team scheduled before Friday. The Jedi were guardians of peace, but also deeply tied into the Republic. They worked as generals, diplomats, and problem solvers. Their influence was enormous, and people generally trusted them, though some politicians probably rolled their eyes every time a robed Jedi strolled into a Senate meeting with "I sense a disturbance" as their opening line. Still, the Jedi were the backbone of the Republic's safety net. Meanwhile, the Sith Empire, at least as far as most people knew, was ancient history. The galaxy believed the Sith were extinct, wiped out after the Great Hyperspace War 1,000 years earlier. That war had been a brutal clash of Jedi and Sith fleets, ending with the Sith losing their empire and vanishing into obscurity. For the Republic and the Jedi, that chapter was closed. No one was watching the shadows anymore. Everyone assumed the dark side had lost for good. But Star Wars being Star Wars, you can guess that wasn't true. The Sith weren't gone, just waiting. In the unknown regions, survivors of the old empire were hiding, rebuilding, and plotting. Nobody in the Republic suspected a thing, which set up the perfect storm for what was coming later. While the Jedi were strong and the Republic was stable, cracks were always forming. Technology was advanced, hyperspace routes connected almost every system, and wealth poured into the core worlds. But the further you went into the outer rim, the rougher life got. Frontier worlds felt neglected, local governors struggled with lawlessness, and organized groups like the Mandalorians saw opportunity in that chaos. The galaxy looked peaceful, but it was the kind of peace where you knew someone, somewhere, was sharpening a blade. This era is also where you see the Jedi Council, at its height, wise and a little too comfortable. They weren't corrupt, but they were cautious. Their memory of disasters like the Exar Kun War was still fresh, and it made them overly careful about getting involved in conflicts. Their instinct was to hold back, debate endlessly, and make sure the Order never repeated old mistakes. So, imagine it, a galaxy where the Republic feels strong and untouchable, the Jedi are practically rock stars, and the Sith are assumed to be a myth. On paper, it's the golden age of peace. This is the world Revan was born into, a galaxy with everything in place for one of the most legendary figures in Star Wars to shake it up completely. While the Republic was busy patting itself on the back for being the galaxy's biggest success story, something was stirring on the edges of civilization. The ones causing trouble at this point were the Mandalorians. If the Republic was the galaxy's giant library, the Mandalorians were the gang of armored kids throwing rocks at the windows. The Mandalorians had already left their mark in earlier centuries. Their religion, their politics, even their family structures. Everything revolved around battle. Winning meant honor, losing meant shame, and peace meant boredom. They weren't content sitting around polishing their armor. They needed to fight to prove themselves. After Exar Kun's fall, the Mandalorians had been knocked down a few pegs. Their fleets were shattered, and their leadership was in chaos. But if history teaches anything about Mandalorians, it's that they don't stay down. Defeat just makes them angrier. Think of them like that one rival sports team that keeps getting eliminated in the playoffs, only to come back next season twice as aggressive. By the time Revan was growing up, Mandalorian clans were rebuilding. The old tradition of raiding and skirmishing returned, first in the Outer Rim, then in bolder attacks. They weren't launching a full-blown war yet, but they were testing the galaxy's defenses. They hit trade routes, attacked border colonies, and reminded everyone that they weren't finished. Slowly, they gathered strength and, more importantly, unity. For Mandalorians, unity is rare. It usually takes a strong leader to pull their warrior clans together. And at this time, a new leader was rising, Mandalore the Ultimate. With a name like that, you can already tell subtlety wasn't his thing. He wanted a war that would cover the galaxy and restore Mandalorian pride. The Mandalorians believed their culture needed constant struggle, and the Republic looked like the ultimate challenge. From the Republic's perspective, the Mandalorians seemed like a nuisance at first. Outer Rim colonies reported raids, but core world senators brushed it off as frontier problems. The Jedi Council noticed the aggression, but they were hesitant to call it a crisis. After all, the Mandalorians had been beaten before. Why panic now? To most people in Coruscant's shining towers, Mandalorian warriors were more of a history book problem than a real threat. They were experimenting with new tactics, testing their fleets, and watching how the Republic responded. Every time a skirmish ended without major retaliation, it taught them something. The Republic was slow to react, the Jedi were cautious, and the galaxy wasn't paying attention. It was the perfect environment to plan a large-scale war. So, while the Republic basked in peace and the Jedi debated philosophy in their tall council chambers, Mandalorian fleets were gathering in secret, and that's the shadow Revan grew up under. Before he ever led fleets or put on his famous mask, the galaxy was already drifting toward war. A warrior culture was rising again, and sooner or later, someone would have to step up to face them. Spoiler, that someone turned out to be Revan. Every great story has its duos, Han and Chewie, Obi-Wan and Anakin. And long before them, there was Revan and Alek. You'll know Alek better by his future title, Darth Malak, the towering Sith with the metal jaw who eventually betrayed Revan. But before the fall, before the betrayals and backstabbing, Alek and Revan were friends. In fact, friends might undersell it. They were brothers in all but blood. Alek came from the same Jedi system as Revan, though his early life looked a little different. While Revan was the golden boy prodigy, Alek was solid. Not untalented, not dull, but compared to Revan's brilliance, he was the kind of student who had to put in the hours. If Revan was the natural who made it look easy, Alek was the guy grinding it out in the background, determined to keep up. And in a way, that's what made him so loyal. He admired Revan's genius, but wasn't jealous of it. He believed in it. Their bond formed during training, and only deepened as they grew older. Both were ambitious in the sense that they wanted to do something meaningful with their lives as Jedi. They weren't content with endless philosophy lessons or sitting in council chambers debating disturbances in the Force. They wanted to act, they wanted to protect, they wanted to make the Jedi matter in the galaxy. For both of them, the Order's caution sometimes felt like a cage, and together they started imagining a different way of doing things. Revan brought the spark, the ideas, the charisma, the strategies. Alek brought the muscle, the loyalty, and a kind of grounding presence. Where Revan questioned everything, Alek had faith in his friend. If Revan wanted to debate the Masters about galactic politics, Alek was the one standing beside him, arms crossed, silently saying, "Yeah," what he said. Of course, Alek wasn't a pushover. He had his own opinions and ideals, but he wasn't as sharp or persuasive as Revan. His strength was in commitment. Once he believed in something, or someone, he was all in. And in this case, that someone was Revan. Physically, Alek was different from Revan too. Tall, broad-shouldered, intimidating, even as a young Jedi Knight. He had the kind of presence that made people hesitate before picking a fight. Where Revan's power came from his mind and presence, Alek's came from sheer physicality. Together, they were a perfect balance. The thinker and the fighter, the tactician and the enforcer. Their friendship also stood out because Jedi weren't exactly encouraged to form close attachments. The Code wasn't a big fan of best friends forever. But the truth is, Jedi weren't robots. They trained together, lived together, and went on missions together. Bonds were inevitable. Revan and Alek's bond was simply stronger than most. Some masters probably raised an eyebrow, but no one could argue with their results. The two complemented each other so well that they often worked as a unit, whether in study, sparring, or assignments. What united them most was their shared impatience with the Council. Both of them looked at the galaxy and saw a republic that was fragile, a Jedi Order that was too cautious, and threats that weren't being dealt with. They believed the Jedi should be more proactive, more willing to lead, instead of waiting for disasters to unfold. This shared outlook made them natural allies, and as time went on it made them dangerous. Not dangerous to each other, dangerous to the status quo. Later, when the Mandalorian threat started to grow, that bond became more than friendship. It became the backbone of the Jedi Crusaders. Thousands of Jedi followed Revan, but Alek was always closest, his right hand, his second in command. Without Alek, Revan's charisma might not have carried as far. Without Revan, Alek might never have found his purpose. Together, they built something bigger than themselves. Of course, hindsight makes all this bittersweet. Knowing that Alek eventually betrayed Revan adds a layer of tragedy to their friendship. But betrayal wasn't written into their early years. Back then, they trusted each other completely. They dreamed of a galaxy they could change together. If history had unfolded differently, maybe they would have remained brothers in arms until the end. But history had other plans. For now, though, it's about two Jedi who believed in the same cause, who pushed each other to greater heights, and who would eventually shape the fate of the galaxy. One as the brilliant leader, the other as the loyal friend, who would later become his rival. The Mandalorians were moving like a storm front, and the Republic knew it. Colonies were being burned, trade routes shattered, refugees pouring into safer systems. Senators panicked, governors begged for help, and ordinary citizens looked to the Jedi for answers. After all, wasn't this exactly what the Jedi were supposed to be for? Guardians of peace, defenders of the Republic. You'd expect them to jump right in. But the reality was, they didn't. The Jedi Council froze. This wasn't out of laziness or cowardice, it was fear, the deep, institutional kind that comes from hard experience. To understand their hesitation, you have to look back a few decades at the disaster of Exar Kun. Exar Kun was a Jedi Knight who became obsessed with ancient Sith teachings. He defied the Council, turned to the dark side, and nearly tore the Republic apart. Thousands of Jedi followed him, seduced by his charisma and his vision of power. The war left scars everywhere. Whole worlds destroyed, Jedi slain, trust in the Order shaken. When it finally ended, the Council swore never to let something like that happen again. So when the Mandalorian raids started turning into an actual threat, the Council looked at the situation through that lens. They remembered what happened the last time Jedi rushed into war. A charismatic leader rose, Jedi were split, and the galaxy bled. They feared history repeating itself. Their response was caution, painful, frustrating, bureaucratic caution. Instead of mobilizing to fight the Mandalorians head-on, they chose to observe. Jedi were dispatched to monitor borders, gather intelligence, and advise local governments, but not to engage in full combat. The official line was, the Mandalorians hadn't launched a war yet, only raids. Why risk another Exar Kun-level disaster over something that might escalate? From their perspective, this made sense. The Jedi believed their greatest failure wasn't losing battles, it was letting themselves be corrupted. They had survived Exar Kun, but barely. If they rushed to fight the Mandalorians and another charismatic Jedi general rose, what if that general turned? What if the Order split again? What if this time they didn't survive? But from the outside, the Council's inaction looked like paralysis. Colonies were burning, and all the Jedi seemed to be doing was holding meetings and whispering about not falling to the dark side. Refugees didn't care about philosophical caution. They wanted protection. Senators saw weakness. Republic soldiers felt abandoned. And young Jedi, those watching people suffer, started to ask hard questions. Among those young Jedi was Revan. Imagine being him, brilliant, ambitious, already asking tough questions about the Order. He saw the Council sitting on their hands while the Republic lost world after world. To him, this wasn't wisdom, it was failure. And he wasn't alone. Many Jedi shared his frustration, including his closest friend, Alek. The Council, of course, wasn't blind to this growing dissatisfaction. They knew younger Jedi were restless. They also knew that someone like Revan, with charisma and vision, could easily spark a movement if pushed, which, ironically, is exactly why they resisted action even harder. They thought if we wait, if we hold the line, maybe this fire will burn itself out before it consumes us. But history doesn't wait for indecision. The Mandalorians weren't slowing down. Their raids became invasions. Their invasions turned into full campaigns. Each time the Republic begged for Jedi support, the Council answered with more patience and more caution. Their refusal wasn't malice, it was trauma. They were terrified of making the same mistake twice. but in trying to avoid the ghost of Exar Kun, they ended up feeding the flames of something even worse. This hesitation shaped everything that came after. It widened the gap between the Council and its younger members. It left the Republic desperate and bleeding. And it set the stage for Revan to step forward, filling the vacuum of leadership the Council had created. In hindsight, it's easy to criticize the Jedi Council for their paralysis. But if you put yourself in their shoes, you see the dilemma. Do you act and risk creating another Exar Kun? Or do you hold back and watch as the Republic falls apart? They chose to hold back, believing restraint was safer than reckless intervention. Unfortunately for them, and for the galaxy, it turned out to be the wrong call. And while the Council hesitated, Revan was sharpening his arguments, winning followers, and preparing to do what they wouldn't. The Mandalorians weren't waiting, and neither was he. Revan was young by Jedi standards, but he already had a reputation that stretched across the Order. The kind of person you wanted to listen to, even if you disagreed. He had the rare ability to make a lecture on galactic history feel exciting, and when he spoke about the Mandalorian threat, you could feel the urgency in his words. At first, his message was simple. The Jedi couldn't keep waiting. The Mandalorians were not going to stop on their own. Every day of inaction meant more worlds enslaved, more lives destroyed. Revan argued that the Jedi weren't bound only to the Council's cautious decrees. They were bound to the Force, and the Force was calling them to act. This was a risky stance. Open defiance of the Council was rare, even dangerous, but Revan had the charisma to pull it off. He wasn't screaming rebellion. He was calm, confident, and utterly sure of his cause. He framed it not as disobedience, but as duty. And that framing worked. Jedi who had been wavering suddenly found themselves inspired. And then there was Malak, still known as Alek at this time. He was larger than life, booming voice, and unstoppable energy. The perfect partner for Revan's measured brilliance. Their movement gained momentum quickly. At first it was a handful of Jedi who quietly agreed to follow them. Then it was dozens. Soon it was hundreds. Before long, they were called the Jedi Crusaders, a name that stuck even though it wasn't an official title. These were Jedi who believed action was the only way forward, who refused to sit back while the galaxy burned. The Republic noticed. Senators who were furious with the Council's inaction began to treat Revan as a kind of alternative authority. Generals who had been struggling with outdated strategies started listening to Revan's ideas. Those ideas worked. Even before he commanded fleets, Revan was sketching out tactics that outmaneuvered the Mandalorians on paper. People began to believe that maybe this young Jedi had the vision to win a war the Republic couldn't. The choice many Jedi faced was painfully simple. Obey the Council and watch the Outer Rim fall, or follow Revan and fight. For thousands, the answer was clear. They packed their robes, said their quiet goodbyes to the temple, and joined the crusade. Revan drew support from all corners of the Republic. Many of them rallied around him. They saw him not as a renegade, but as the leader they'd been waiting for. And Revan leaned into that role. He wore a distinctive mask, taken from a fallen Mandalorian, both as a symbol and as protection. The mask became iconic, setting him apart from other Jedi, almost like a banner for his movement. For his followers, it was proof that Revan wasn't just another council member wrapped in politics. He was someone who had stepped into the fire with them. The first real victories of the Crusaders came quickly. With Revan at the helm, Republic forces finally began to outthink the Mandalorians. He predicted their moves, cut off their supply lines, and struck where they least expected. Small battles that would have been certain losses before turned into decisive wins. For the first time, the Republic had hope, and hope is powerful. When word spread that Revan's forces were pushing back the Mandalorians, recruitment surged. Jedi who had hesitated started crossing the line to join him. Republic soldiers began to fight harder, knowing they had a commander who could actually win. Even civilians began to whisper his name with reverence. Of course, this created even deeper fractures. The Council condemned his actions more strongly than ever, but they couldn't stop him without tearing the Order apart. And at this point it was too late. Revan wasn't a lone voice anymore. He was the leader of a movement, a military force, and an idea bigger than any one Jedi. That was the birth of the Jedi Crusaders. Not a splinter group chasing power for themselves, but a generation of Jedi and soldiers who decided the Council had failed and the galaxy couldn't wait. They were young, they were idealistic, and under Revan's command, they were ready to fight a war the Republic had been losing from the start. The Council's worst fears might have been echoing in the background, but to the Crusaders, all that mattered was this. Revan had given them a choice, and they had chosen action. The Outer Rim became the crucible of the Mandalorian Wars. If the core was the Republic's beating heart, the Outer Rim was its shield, and that shield was buckling under the pressure. For years, Mandalorians had swept through colony after colony, overwhelming local defenses and daring the Republic to stop them. Now, with Revan leading the Jedi Crusaders, the Republic finally had someone bold enough to try. The early battles weren't easy. In fact, most of them were ugly. The Republic Navy was still clunky, out of date, and riddled with officers who had never fought a real war. Meanwhile, the Mandalorians thrived on chaos. They didn't fight like the Republic expected them to. They weren't afraid to split their forces, strike multiple targets at once, or sacrifice ships in sudden kamikaze runs just to create openings. Against that kind of enemy, the Republic kept stumbling. Revan saw this firsthand. He didn't waste time blaming the Senate or waiting for the Council's approval. He adapted. He studied the Mandalorians not just as opponents, but as a culture. They weren't fighting to hold territory or secure trade routes. They were fighting to prove themselves, to carve their legacy into galactic history. Revan realized that if you wanted to beat the Mandalorians, you couldn't outgun them. You had to outthink them. So he did. Revan's first great contribution was shifting the way the Republic fought. Instead of lumbering into battle with massive fleets meant to overwhelm by size, he started using mobility and precision. He broke the Navy into smaller, faster strike groups. These groups could respond to raids, set traps, and cut supply lines without waiting weeks for reinforcements. It was risky, because smaller groups meant less margin for error, but it played directly against the Mandalorians' expectations. And it worked. Suddenly, instead of chasing Mandalorian fleets and always arriving too late, Revan's forces began ambushing them. Mandalorian commanders who were used to easy victories found themselves caught off guard. Battles that would have been crushing defeats for the Republic turned into narrow but meaningful wins. Take the defense of Surja. The Mandalorians launched a massive offensive to seize the system's shipyards, one of the few Outer Rim facilities still producing warships for the Republic. Normally, the Republic would have thrown its entire fleet at them, a frontal clash that the Mandalorians would almost certainly win. Instead, Revan split his forces into two groups. One openly defended the shipyards, drawing the Mandalorian fleet in. The other hid in a nearby asteroid belt. When the Mandalorians committed, Revan's hidden fleet struck from behind, cutting their supply ships to pieces. The Mandalorians fought like demons, but without supplies, their fleet had no choice but to retreat. The shipyards survived, and for the first time, the Republic felt like it had scored a real victory. But Revan's brilliance wasn't just in tactics, it was in psychology. He knew how to fight the Mandalorians on their own terms. Where most Republic generals treated them like pirates to be suppressed, Revan treated them like warriors to be outplayed. He gave them battles that looked like glorious challenges, then flipped the table at the last second. That kind of approach demoralized them more than any simple defeat could. His strategies weren't universally loved, though. Some senators thought he was reckless, risking fleets in daring maneuvers that could have backfired catastrophically. Some Jedi worried he was becoming too enamored with war, too comfortable in command. But for soldiers on the front lines, those concerns didn't matter. What mattered was that for the first time, they weren't always losing. Malak, always at Revan's side, became the rallying voice of the crusade. While Revan laid out the strategies, Malak inspired the troops with fiery speeches and sheer presence. Soldiers who had been worn down by years of defeat found new energy under their leadership. The two of them together, Revan the mind, Malak the heart, were turning the war around, one hard-fought battle at a time, but every victory came at a cost. The Outer Rim was vast, and the Mandalorians were relentless. Even as Revan won key battles, countless smaller colonies were still falling. The war became a grind, a constant back and forth that chewed through lives and resources, and every battle Revan fought left its mark on him. The young Jedi who had once debated philosophy in the temple was now a hardened commander, making choices that blurred the line between necessity and morality. One of those choices was his growing reliance on intelligence networks. Revan encouraged the use of spies, scouts, and even smugglers to gather information on Mandalorian movements. He argued that knowledge was the only way to counter the Mandalorians' unpredictability. For some Jedi, that was troubling. Collaborating with criminals went against their code. But for Revan, the code mattered less than the lives it could save. And slowly, the results began to show. Systems that had resigned themselves to inevitable defeat started to resist again. Soldiers fought harder, civilians rebuilt faster, and whispers spread across the galaxy. Maybe the Republic could win this war. Still, everyone knew the Outer Rim campaign was only the beginning. Revan could win skirmishes and battles, but the Mandalorians weren't going to be stopped so easily. They had momentum, resources, and the will to fight to the last warrior. The Republic had hope again, yes, but hope alone wasn't enough. The war was far from over, and Revan knew it. Every victory he achieved pushed him further down a path that few Jedi had ever walked. He was a general, a strategist, a symbol, and the deeper he went into that role, the further he drifted from the quiet ideals of the Jedi Order. The Outer Rim battles forged Revan into something new, as the one figure who could actually deliver them from the storm. Malak's rise wasn't formal, at least not in any Republic-approved sense. He wasn't given a rank by the Senate or appointed by the Jedi Council. His authority came from Revan's trust and the soldiers' respect. On the battlefield, his presence alone could turn the tide of a fight. Troops followed him because he was unflinching in combat, fierce with loyalty, and had a kind of magnetic intensity that drew people in. The partnership worked brilliantly. The Council's hesitancy had already created tension, but now their disapproval became more pointed. To the Council, Revan wasn't merely ignoring orders. He was leading thousands of Jedi and soldiers in what looked like a rogue campaign. They warned him repeatedly, using their authority as Jedi Masters to demand restraint. But Revan was no ordinary student, and he had no interest in being constrained by bureaucratic caution. Malak, ever loyal, stood beside Revan through it all. He wasn't concerned with protocol, philosophy, or political niceties. The galaxy was burning, and people were dying. To Malak, action mattered more than rules, and results mattered more than approvals. His unwavering support gave Revan the confidence to defy the Council, but it also amplified the perception that the Crusaders were a renegade force rather than a legitimate campaign. Malak's own role deepened during this period. He began taking on independent commands, leading flanking maneuvers, overseeing supply lines, and making snap decisions that often meant life or death for entire battalions. Unlike Revan, who excelled at predicting the enemy's movements and planning complex strategies, Malak thrived in the immediacy of combat. His instinct for tactics was intuitive, almost animalistic. He was fearless and sometimes reckless, but always effective. Soldiers called him the Hammer, because when he arrived, the fight shifted. But that effectiveness came with complications. Malak's growing prominence highlighted the strain in the Jedi Order's chain of command. Younger Jedi admired him as a hero, sometimes even more than they did Revan. Older Jedi worried that he was becoming dangerously influential, someone whose loyalty to Revan might eventually overpower loyalty to the Council, or worse, the Jedi Code itself. Even within the Crusaders, tension surfaced. Malak and Revan were united in purpose, but differences in style were evident. Revan often considered the moral weight of decisions, even when ruthless measures were necessary. Malak, by contrast, could be brutally pragmatic. Where Revan saw strategy with ethical restraint, Malak saw strategy in pure efficiency. These differences rarely caused public conflict, but among the inner circle of officers, whispers began. At the same time, the Council's distrust deepened. They formally reprimanded Revan on several occasions, warning him that continuing his campaign without Council approval could have long-term consequences, not only politically but spiritually. The Jedi were trained to resist attachments, to question authority carefully, and to avoid hubris. Revan's rapid rise, combined with Malak's visible prowess, looked dangerously close to hubris in their eyes. They feared that victory could corrupt even the brightest Jedi if they weren't tethered to the Order. For Revan, these pressures were fuel. The Council's warnings reinforced his belief that the Jedi were too cautious, too detached from the reality of suffering in the galaxy, and Malak's unwavering support made defiance easier, more natural. They weren't only fighting the Mandalorians, they were challenging the Order's inertia, proving that decisive action could save lives where deliberation failed. As the Crusaders pushed deeper into the Outer Rim, victories accumulated. Revan's strategies were proving effective, and Malak's battlefield leadership inspired legends. Allies admired them, enemies feared them, and the galaxy slowly began to see a new kind of Jedi emerging, one willing to operate outside the traditional rules, guided more by necessity and vision than protocol. It was the beginning of a transformation. The Outer Rim battles had forged Revan and Malak into something more than Jedi. They were leaders, symbols, and catalysts. And while they were still young, still learning, the shadows of what would come, the hard choices, moral compromises, and eventual descent into darkness, were beginning to lengthen behind them. For now, though, the focus was simple: win battles, save the Republic, and survive the Mandalorian onslaught. And together, Revan and Malak were unmatched in achieving that. By the time the Crusaders reached Dxon, the war had already claimed countless lives and left the Outer Rim scarred. Dxon itself was a crucial system, a dense forested planet with a history of Mandalorian occupation and hidden installations. Controlling it meant controlling a vital staging area for future campaigns. Revan approached Dxon with the careful precision that had become his hallmark. Years of observing the Mandalorians had taught him that their greatest strength was adaptability. Each move required anticipation, planning, and the willingness to make hard, immediate decisions. He divided the Republic forces into coordinated strike teams, blending orbital bombardments with ground assaults and rapid response fleets. This multi-pronged approach wasn't common in the Republic Navy. Typically, they relied on massive fleet engagements, letting sheer numbers crush the enemy. Revan's strategy was different: mobility, deception, and the precise application of force. Dxon's dense forests provided natural cover for Mandalorian forces. They could hide troops, set ambushes, and stage counterattacks without detection. Revan accounted for this by deploying scouts and sensor arrays to detect movement early. When Mandalorians thought they were striking the Republic by surprise, they were already walking into traps designed to disrupt their formations and fracture their chains of command. The battle itself unfolded with staggering intensity. Orbital bombardments softened Mandalorian positions, while strike teams landed in multiple sectors simultaneously. Revan personally coordinated the flow of forces, shifting reserves to reinforce vulnerable points and cutting off enemy retreat paths. Malak led the assault on key Mandalorian fortifications, his presence boosting morale and intimidating the defenders. The synergy between the two commanders was a critical factor in the Republic's success. Victory wasn't immediate. Mandalorian resistance was fierce, and for every position the Republic took, another seemed to spring up in ambush. Casualties were high on both sides, and the dense terrain made conventional tactics less effective. But Revan's strategy emphasized flexibility over brute force. He adapted as the battle unfolded, anticipating Mandalorian maneuvers and outflanking them at critical moments. The turning point came when Revan executed a flanking maneuver no Mandalorian commander expected. Using a combination of shuttle-borne infantry and orbital bombardment timed to coincide with ground attacks, he isolated the enemy's core battalions. Mandalorian forces found themselves trapped between Revan's main army and a secondary strike team, with no route of escape. The Mandalorians fought valiantly, but the trap was perfect. By nightfall, Dxon was firmly under Republic control. The victory at Dxon had effects beyond the immediate tactical advantage. It sent a clear message across the Outer Rim. The Crusaders were not just a temporary force. They were a competent, decisive army, capable of matching the Mandalorians blow for blow. Systems that had resigned themselves to defeat began organizing resistance, bolstered by the example set at Dxon. Revan himself emerged from the battle with a reputation that extended beyond military skill. Soldiers admired his calm decisiveness under fire. Jedi who had once doubted him saw the proof of his leadership. Even those in the Council, who had remained skeptical, were forced to acknowledge that, at least on the battlefield, Revan's methods were effective. The momentum gained at Dxon set the tone for subsequent campaigns. Mandalorian forces, while still formidable, were now reacting to Revan instead of the other way around. They could no longer rely solely on mobility and intimidation. They had to account for a commander who anticipated their moves, manipulated terrain, and forced decisive engagements. This momentum also reinforced the bond between Revan and Malak. Malak's aggressive assaults complemented Revan's strategic planning, creating a balance that allowed the Republic to maintain pressure across multiple fronts. Soldiers and Jedi alike rallied around their leadership, forming a tightly knit, effective fighting force that became the core of the Crusaders' identity. Revan's reliance on extreme tactics, orbital strikes, preemptive attacks, and calculated sacrifices began to weigh on his conscience. Each victory saved lives in the long term, but every loss of civilians, every world damaged in the process, left a mark. Revan's decisions were pragmatic, but they were no longer purely moral choices. They were calculated gambles, each one a step toward the darker decisions that lay ahead. Dxon marked the first major turning point in the war. It was a demonstration of what could be accomplished when the Republic acted decisively and intelligently, guided by leadership willing to embrace difficult choices. It was proof that the Crusaders' methods worked, that the momentum they had built could be sustained, and that the Mandalorians could be beaten. For the Outer Rim, it was a breath of relief. For the Crusaders, it was validation of their purpose. And for Revan, it was the first clear signal that the path he had chosen, one of pragmatism, risk, and moral compromise, was the only way to secure victory. If you've ever looked at a planet and thought, you know what this place needs? A gravitational nightmare that rips everything apart. Congratulations, you'd fit right in with Revan's War Council. Because that's basically what happened at Malachor 5, one of the most catastrophic battles in Star Wars history. And it all starts with a superweapon that sounds like something your physics teacher warned you about. The Mass Shadow Generator. Not exactly a vacation spot even before the battle. It was a dark, twisted planet in the Outer Rim, steeped in the dark side, like it had been soaking in Sith marinade for centuries. Its surface? Jagged obsidian canyons, swirling storms, and a general sense of, you probably shouldn't be here. Jedi usually avoid places like that, except when they decide to have a full-scale war there. Then, apparently, it's fine. Revan chose Malachor 5 as the ultimate showdown with the Mandalorians. The Mandalorians loved a good fight. Give them a planet that looks like a metal album cover, and they'll happily turn it into their last stand. This was it, the final battle of the Mandalorian Wars. Every major fleet, every ace commander, everyone who mattered in the war, showed up for this galactic demolition derby. The Mandalorians had been losing ground, sure, but they weren't about to quit. Mandalore the Ultimate himself gathered his best warriors, their most brutal ships, and their legendary basilisk war droids for a fight to the death. For them it was honor, and if you've ever met a Mandalorian, you know honor usually means fight until literally everything explodes. On the other side you had Revan's fleet, sleek Republic cruisers, reinforcements from dozens of sectors, and Jedi commanders who were, let's say, morally flexible by this point in the war. Now, about the Mass Shadow Generator. Sounds cool, right? It was the brainchild of a Republic engineer named Baudur, a Zabrak genius who took one look at gravity and said, I can weaponize that. The idea was terrifyingly simple. Create an artificial mass shadow, an intense gravity field so strong it would crush everything in its pull. Ships, soldiers, whole fleets. Oh, and maybe the planet too. Totally normal wartime innovation. Revan put this doomsday device in the hands of Jedi General Mitra Surik, who would later become the Jedi Exile. Her job? Hold the Republic forces together, keep the Mandalorians distracted, and when the signal came, flip the switch. Easy, sure, except triggering a weapon that can destroy fleets and crack a planet isn't exactly the kind of thing you put on a checklist. The battle began like any other space slaughter. Massive warships traded fire in orbit, while fighter squadrons zipped through the chaos. Below, ground troops clashed across Malachor's surface in brutal hand-to-hand combat, fighting through endless storms of debris. It was a meat grinder, blasters, vibroblades, and explosions everywhere. If you were there, you probably couldn't even hear yourself think. Not that you'd want to think about where you were, because that would mean realizing you were about to become part of a physics experiment gone wrong. As the Mandalorians pushed forward, the Republic lines bent, just like Revan wanted. Every move, every retreat was calculated to lure the enemy into position. And then, when the fleets were tangled together over Malachor's gravity well like a giant metal hairball, the signal came. The mass shadow generator roared to life. Imagine gravity on steroids. The weapon pulled ships into each other, crushing them like tin cans. Frigates collapsed, battleships snapped in half, entire squadrons vanished into spiraling death. The Mandalorian fleet didn't stand a chance. And it wasn't only the Mandalorians. Republic ships too were torn apart in the chaos. Friendly fire, more like friendly obliteration. Down on the surface, the effect was even worse. Malachor 5 itself began to scream, figuratively, because planets don't actually scream, but you get the idea. The gravitational forces twisted the crust, shattered continents, and turned the battlefield into a chasm-ridden hellscape. Soldiers, Republic and Mandalorian alike, were crushed into the ground or hurled into the void. Nobody down there had a chance. It wasn't a fight anymore. It was pure annihilation. And just like that, the Mandalorian wars were over. The Mandalorian fleet was gone. Their warriors, their leaders, their honor, all swallowed by a gravity well the size of a planet. Revan had won, but at a cost so horrifying that even the Jedi Council would be like, "You did what?" Which, spoiler alert, is exactly what happened later. Malachor 5 would never be the same. It became a wound in the Force, a dead world orbiting its own broken fragments. And somewhere in that storm of debris, the galaxy changed forever. The Mandalorian threat had been broken, the Outer Rim temporarily secured, and the Republic's morale restored. Yet for Revan, victory came with a profound cost. The battle had forced him to confront questions no Jedi had prepared him for. How far is too far when lives are at stake? When does pragmatism become moral compromise? And who determines the line between necessity and darkness? Revan wandered the forests and ruins of Malachor 5 in the days after the battle, surveying the consequences of the mass shadow generator. He had seen Mandalorian fleets reduced to debris, planetary installations flattened, and countless lives lost in an instant. Strategically, it was flawless. Morally, it was harrowing. He felt the weight of every choice pressing down on him, a heaviness that even the Force could not fully absorb. Malak, by contrast, remained untroubled. To him, Malachor was proof of the Crusaders' effectiveness. Success justified the methods. Victory was all that mattered. The contrast between their reactions highlighted the first subtle divergence between the two. Revan was reflective, questioning, aware of the long-term implications of their actions. Malak was decisive, relentless, and unconcerned with moral ambiguity. The difference was not yet conflict, it was tension, quiet but persistent, a shadow forming between the two leaders. The Jedi Council attempted to assert influence, but their words rang hollow to Revan. They criticized the use of the mass shadow generator, labeled it as morally reckless, and demanded explanations. But in his mind, their moralizing felt irrelevant. Had they acted decisively? Could the Outer Rim have survived without such measures? Revan's answer was clear: no. The Council's inaction had left countless worlds defenseless. Their caution had nearly cost the Republic everything. In the wake of Malachor, Revan began to question not just the Council, but the very framework of the Jedi Order. Their insistence on detachment and hesitation, their strict adherence to dogma, seemed insufficient for a galaxy in crisis. He began to think in terms the Council would not approve. The Force demanded results, not debates. Action, even if morally grey, could prevent greater tragedy. In those moments, Revan realized that conventional Jedi wisdom might not be enough to guide the galaxy through what lay ahead. The psychological toll extended beyond ethical questions. The massive destruction and the deaths of countless civilians left Revan with a profound sense of isolation. Many Jedi, still shaken by the horrors of Malachor, retreated inward, questioning whether they had done enough. Revan, however, felt compelled to continue, driven by the urgency of the galaxy's survival. The line between duty and obsession began to blur. He was no longer a Jedi following orders. He was a general making choices that could shape the fate of countless worlds. Revan's soul, once firmly anchored in the ideals of the Jedi, now found itself on unfamiliar terrain. The Force whispered differently here, not in calm guidance, but in the echo of consequence. Every decision to sacrifice one world for many, to use overwhelming force against a determined enemy, weighed on him. It was not evil, he felt, but a shadow, the first hint of the moral ambiguity that would later define him. The aftermath of Malachor also revealed cracks within the Crusaders themselves. Some Jedi questioned the morality of the mass shadow generator, others the wisdom of Revan's growing independence from the Council. These murmurs, while quiet, added to the sense of isolation that Revan carried. Even as the Outer Rim celebrated their liberation, he felt the distance between his choices and the expectations of the Order widening. Amid these challenges, Revan's bond with Malak remained strong but complex. Malak saw the battle purely as a success, and while he admired Revan's leadership, he did not share the same internal struggle. The divergence in their moral frameworks foreshadowed future tension. With the Mandalorian Wars effectively concluded, Revan and Malak faced a new challenge. The universe they had fought to protect was not as secure as it seemed. Even with the Outer Rim stabilized, whispers of a greater hidden power reached their ears. Intelligence reports hinted at a presence in the unknown regions, a force older and more dangerous than any the Republic had encountered. The Mandalorians were no longer the ultimate threat. They were a symptom of a deeper, more insidious danger. Revan understood that the Council would never sanction a deep space expedition. They still hesitated, still debated, still clung to the safety of known systems. But the galaxy was changing. The unknown regions were vast, largely unmapped, and filled with anomalies that challenged both navigation and the Force itself. Star systems could appear or vanish without warning. Gravitational phenomena could destroy fleets, and reports of ancient Sith remnants lingered like shadows in the void. Despite the risks, Revan and Malak took command of a small fleet and embarked on a journey beyond the Republic's borders. Their goal was twofold: to uncover the source of the Sith resurgence hinted at in intelligence, and to strike preemptively if necessary. For Revan, this was an opportunity to apply lessons learned from the Mandalorian Wars, strategic foresight, decisive action, and moral pragmatism on a scale that the galaxy had never seen. The unknown regions were hostile in ways the Crusaders could hardly have imagined. Navigation charts failed, sensors picked up distorted readings, and entire fleets were sometimes swallowed by nebulae or gravitational storms. The further they ventured, the clearer it became that conventional Republic tactics were insufficient. Revan relied heavily on intuition, force sensitivity, and an adaptive approach to fleet movements. Malak, ever the executor, thrived in this environment. He commanded landing parties, led skirmishes, and acted as the stabilizing force to Revan's visionary strategies. Their exploration revealed signs of the Sith: ancient fortresses, hidden bases, and encoded messages pointing to a singular, terrifying entity, the Sith Emperor, later known as Vitiate. Revan and Malak pieced together fragments of history, discovering that the Sith had not been destroyed as the Republic believed. They had survived in secret, building power, waiting for the right moment to strike. The Mandalorian threat, brutal though it had been, was only a prelude to something far more dangerous. Disturbances and dark echoes emanating from the Sith influenced even the most disciplined Jedi. Revan felt these currents acutely, sensing the presence of immense power, manipulating events from afar. He realized that confronting this enemy would require not only tactical brilliance, but also the capacity to embrace moral ambiguity on an unprecedented scale. Success would demand choices the Council would never approve. As they continued deeper, Revan and Malak encountered remnants of ancient Sith fleets and strongholds, many abandoned but still lethal due to automated defenses or lingering force traps. The Sith were no longer an abstraction. They were a tangible force, with plans, motivations, and a vision for the galaxy that opposed the Republic at every turn. Understanding them required stepping beyond the moral boundaries he had known as a Jedi, questioning assumptions about light, dark, and balance. It was a turning point in his thinking. Victory might demand embracing power in ways previously considered forbidden. Malak remained a steady ally, though the differences in their perspectives began to grow more pronounced. Malak's focus on strength and decisive action contrasted with Revan's growing awareness of ethical nuance and strategic foresight. These differences were not yet conflict. They were the first indications that their partnership, while unbreakable in war, might later face strain when confronted with the full weight of the Sith threat. Revan had seen many strange worlds, but nothing could prepare him for Drummond Cass. It was a planet shrouded in darkness, as if the storms themselves obeyed the will of the Sith Emperor. The air was heavy, a pull on the mind, a whisper that said, "Stay, serve, kneel." And kneeling was not something Revan made a habit of. He had led fleets, toppled Mandalore, and turned the Republic into a war machine. Yet here, on this forgotten Sith world, he was just another pawn, stepping onto the board. Beside him was Malak, still Alek at heart, though that heart was growing colder with every step. He had followed Revan through war and fire, but this was different. The Emperor was already ancient by the time Revan and Malak arrived. His real name was Tenebrae, but that sounded too friendly for someone who had murdered his entire family at the age of 10. Over the centuries, he had become something more than Sith, something almost alien. When the two Jedi approached his throne, they weren't standing before a man. They were standing before hunger, wrapped in flesh. The throne room was an ocean of shadows. The Sith Lords lined the walls, each one radiating malice like a bonfire, yet compared to the Emperor, they were candles flickering in the wind. The Emperor's influence was not instantaneous. He relied on patient escalation, presenting Revan and Malak with increasingly difficult moral choices, dilemmas where the lines between right and wrong blurred. Each decision nudged them further down a path of autonomy from the Republic. The Outer Rim campaign had already shown Revan the limitations of Council oversight. Now, the Emperor offered validation that action, decisive, uncompromising action, was the only way to preserve the galaxy. Revan's initial encounters with the Emperor were confusing and disorienting. He felt a presence in the Force, a vast intelligence that seemed both alien and intimately aware of his thoughts. This was not a mere adversary. It was a force capable of anticipating his strategies, predicting outcomes, and shaping perception. Even Malak, whose mind was focused on action over introspection, could sense the subtle power being wielded against them. The Emperor's reach was immense, yet invisible, his influence creeping into the Crusaders' decisions without overt confrontation. At first, Revan resisted. He questioned the Emperor's motives, tested his influence, and sought to understand the truth behind the whispers. But the Emperor was patient. He did not demand loyalty outright. He offered glimpses of forbidden knowledge and assurances that the galaxy's future rested in the hands of those willing to act decisively. Each revelation pulled Revan further, challenging the ideals instilled by the Jedi Order and the moral framework that had guided him throughout his life. Malak's response contrasted sharply. He accepted the Emperor's manipulations more readily, interpreting them as confirmation of his beliefs. Power, control, and dominance were virtues in his eyes. Where Revan hesitated, Malak leaned forward. This divergence in their responses highlighted an emerging fault line between the two friends, one guided by moral calculation, the other increasingly by ambition. It was subtle, invisible to most, but the Emperor could see it clearly. This difference would later fuel the fracture that reshaped the Sith Empire. The Emperor also demonstrated the terrifying reach of the dark side. He did not simply influence Revan and Malak. He revealed glimpses of potential futures, showing the consequences of hesitation and the results of decisive action. These visions were intoxicating. Revan, already conditioned by the Mandalorian Wars to make difficult choices, found them compelling. Malak, whose instincts favored action over contemplation, found them exhilarating. Both were drawn deeper into the Emperor's orbit, though in fundamentally different ways. Revan and Malak thought they were learning secrets, gaining power, preparing to lead a crusade against the Republic's enemies. In truth, they were being hollowed out. Imagine being force-pulled by a planet-sized magnet. You could fight it for a second, maybe two, but in the end, resistance was like trying to stop a hurricane with a hand fan. The Emperor had planted the idea that traditional Jedi ethics were inadequate for the galaxy's survival. That true power, unchecked, decisive, and willing to embrace moral ambiguity, was the only path to lasting security. Revan, cautious but increasingly convinced, began to see the Emperor not purely as a threat, but as a source of knowledge and opportunity. What had begun as a mission to secure the unknown regions and confront a hidden threat evolved into a journey that would reshape Revan's identity, morality, and destiny. Over time, Revan's philosophy shifted. He began to see the Republic as fragile and the Jedi as limited. The galaxy, in his mind, required leaders capable of action, unconstrained by dogma. The Emperor framed the Jedi's moral framework not as guidance, but as chains, limitations that prevented true understanding and decisive intervention. The transition from Jedi General to Sith Apprentice was gradual but inexorable. The Emperor did not demand submission. He offered it as a choice. Revan's mind found the idea compelling: to wield the power necessary to protect the galaxy, to confront threats before they could strike, and to enforce stability where hesitation had failed. Eventually, the Emperor formalized Revan's induction into the Sith. The transformation was symbolic and practical. A new identity, a mask of darkness, and the title of Darth Revan marked the point of no return. He was no longer merely a Jedi or a Republic general. He was a Sith, a student of the dark side, and a vessel for a vision of galactic order shaped by power and strategic dominance. Malak followed willingly, taking the title of Darth Malak. But Revan's path was different. He struggled internally, balancing remnants of Jedi morality with the ruthless pragmatism required by the dark side. This internal tension defined Revan's early years as Darth Revan. Unlike traditional Sith, who often sought power for its own sake, Revan saw the dark side as a tool. His aim was not chaos or personal domination, it was preemptive security. To defeat the true Sith threat, to prevent the galaxy from descending into chaos again, he reasoned, he needed the power the Emperor offered, and that meant embracing the dark side fully. Thus, the seed of Revan's empire was planted. The galaxy would soon witness a figure who had once been its protector, now rising as its most enigmatic and formidable force. The transformation was neither simple nor purely sinister. It was born from necessity, shaped by circumstance, and fueled by a pragmatic vision of survival that combined the lessons of the past with the terrifying potential of the dark side. Darth Revan was no longer a hero in the conventional sense, nor was he a villain born of ambition alone. He was something new, a force of decisive action, strategic brilliance and moral complexity, poised to challenge the Republic, the Jedi, and even the Emperor himself. And with this transformation, the stage was set for the rise of the Sith Empire and the next chapter of galactic history. And so Revan and Alek were reborn. Together, they were tasked with a mission that would shape the galaxy for centuries, to lead the Emperor's will into the Republic, to prepare it for conquest and to break it from within. After embracing the dark side and taking the mantle of Darth Revan, the next step in the Crusaders' evolution was the discovery of the Starforge. The Jedi archives dismissed it as an exaggerated tale, a space station the size of a small moon that could build entire fleets out of raw energy, bending the laws of physics like clay. The idea was absurd, until Revan and Malak found it. It began with a map, actually 7 maps, ancient star charts, scattered like breadcrumbs across the galaxy, hidden on worlds where the Rakata had once ruled. Kashyyyk, Korriban, Manaan, Tatooine, even Dantooine, each fragment guarded by the echoes of a civilization that had burned out long before the Republic was born. Revan wasn't just searching blindly. Every step was calculated, every ancient ruin he walked through, bringing him closer to something the Jedi would never dare touch. After piecing together the final star map, the location was revealed, a system cloaked in darkness, uncharted, unreachable by normal hyperlanes. The unknown regions. Of course it had to be there, because nothing galaxy-shattering ever happens on a nice, well-lit core world, right? The planet was Lehon, a graveyard of shattered ships orbiting an azure world like bones circling a predator. Gravity wells had dragged countless fleets to their doom here. When Revan's forces arrived, the wreckage of entire armadas floated in eternal silence. Republic cruisers, Mandalorian warships, pirate vessels. It was like a museum of everyone who ever tried to be important and failed. Descending into the planet's atmosphere, Revan and Malak found the remnants of the Rakatan people. Once masters of the galaxy, now reduced to primitive tribes barely clinging to survival. The force was thick here, but not the warm, life-affirming current the Jedi knew. No, this was different. Dark, oppressive, a reminder that power has a price. Revan didn't flinch. Malak didn't either. If anything, they both felt at home. And then, there it was, the Starforge. Orbiting Lehon like a malignant jewel, it pulsed with energy that shouldn't exist. It was a living wound in reality, feeding on the Force itself. Imagine a space station the size of a city, powered by a star, but also by life energy, by the Force drawn from everything around it. It was a dark side engine with a will. When Revan and Malak stepped aboard, they saw opportunity. Rows of skeletal assembly arms stretched into the void, pulling raw matter from the sun, shaping warships at a speed the Republic couldn't even dream of matching. Entire fleets could be birthed in days, each vessel humming with the dark side because the forge itself was steeped in it. Revan claimed the Starforge as his own. No longer just a fallen Jedi, no longer merely a warlord, he was becoming something far more dangerous. A builder of worlds, a forger of destiny. Malak, of course, stood at his side, grinning like a man who just found an entire buffet of destruction and didn't know where to start. But the Starforge had its price. It whispered, it corrupted. Even Revan, brilliant and disciplined, felt its hunger gnawing at him. The Forge fed on life, on the Force itself. Every ship it produced, every weapon, was steeped in darkness. For most, that would be a deal-breaker. For Revan, it was Tuesday. And so began the rise of a new Sith empire. Fleets rolled out of the Starforge like waves of steel and fire, and for the first time in millennia, the galaxy trembled before a Sith Lord whose ambition was matched only by his ingenuity. The Republic had no idea what was coming. How could they? Their greatest hero had vanished into the unknown regions and returned with a god machine that could build an infinite war. The war that followed would scar the galaxy forever. But that's another story. For now, all you need to know is this. When Revan stepped off the Starforge for the first time, he wasn't the man who landed on Lehon. With the Starforge fueling their war machine, Revan and Malak began to extend the Sith Empire. The core worlds, the heart of the Republic, were their first target. These systems were heavily populated, politically influential, and vital for controlling trade, communications, and military logistics. Revan understood that success here would not only cripple the Republic's ability to respond, but also demonstrate the might of the Sith Empire to the entire galaxy. The strategy was methodical. Revan didn't rely solely on overwhelming force. He combined speed, surprise, and psychological warfare. Worlds were brought under control not just through fleets and firepower, but by demonstrating the inevitability of the Sith's ascendancy. Propaganda, fear, and the display of Starforge-produced fleets amplified the perception of invincibility. Many core worlds surrendered without resistance, recognizing that defiance was futile against an opponent capable of building entire armadas in weeks. The core worlds campaign was not without challenges. Some systems resisted, leveraging old Jedi fortifications, loyal military forces, and strategic alliances. Revan's genius shone in overcoming these obstacles. He combined naval maneuvers with planetary infiltration, force-assisted reconnaissance, and carefully timed strikes to neutralize enemy strongholds. Unlike conventional Sith, who relied on brute force, Revan employed calculated measures designed to minimize unnecessary losses while achieving maximum effect. Every victory strengthened the Empire and expanded its resource base. Revan's conquests were also political as well as military. Many planetary leaders were given a choice: cooperate and retain local authority under Sith oversight, or resist and face annihilation. This approach created a mix of reluctant allies, pragmatic collaborators, and terrified populations, allowing Revan to extend control without expending endless resources on occupation. Systems that joined willingly provided taxation, ships, and troops, further expanding the Empire's reach. And all that led to Jedi Civil War. The Jedi Civil War was a bit more complicated than the name suggests. It wasn't simply Jedi versus Jedi, though Jedi were involved on both sides. It was essentially a galaxy-wide civil war, triggered by a Revan and Malak. In parallel, Revan implemented a system of strategic outposts and supply chains, ensuring that the Starforge could continuously produce forces without interruption. His foresight accounted for potential Republic counterattacks, pirate activity, and internal rebellion. By integrating logistical planning with tactical operations, Revan created a self-sustaining war machine, one that could project force across vast distances with unprecedented speed. The psychological impact on the Republic was profound. Core worlds that had once felt secure found themselves facing a foe capable of overwhelming them at multiple points simultaneously. Communications were disrupted, fleets intercepted, and planetary defenses neutralized before effective coordination could occur. Revan's combination of strategic genius, the raw power of the Starforge, and the unpredictable maneuvers of Malak created a sense that the Sith Empire was not winning. It was inevitable. Planets were integrated into the Empire efficiently. Governance systems were retained when beneficial, and civilian populations were often spared when resistance proved futile. He understood that the galaxy would remember cruelty, but it would also respect order. Unlike the Mandalorian Wars, where destruction was sometimes unavoidable, Revan aimed to build an empire that combined power, stability, and fear, a blend that ensured long-term dominance. By the end of the initial conquests, the Sith Empire had transformed from a concept in the unknown regions to a tangible force capable of challenging the Republic directly. Star systems that had once seemed impregnable now recognized the authority of Revan and Malak. Fleets produced by the Starforge patrolled hyperspace lanes, and resistance was systematically dismantled. Revan's vision of an empire capable of decisive, sustainable control had become reality. Through these campaigns, Revan proved not only his tactical brilliance, but his understanding of human and alien behavior on a galactic scale. By the time the Jedi Civil War was in full swing, Darth Revan and Darth Malak had become legends, feared across the galaxy, commanding fleets that swallowed worlds whole. To the Republic, they were monsters. To the Sith forces, they had rallied, they were living gods. But the thing about gods, there's never room for two on the same throne. Malak had once been Revan's closest friend. He was there, through every step of Revan's fall into darkness, first as his voice of reason, then as his willing accomplice. But power changes everything. Malak was bold, impulsive, a warrior at heart who preferred smashing doors down to playing political games. Revan, on the other hand, was the strategist, the calm, calculating master who treated war like an elaborate Dxon board. To Malak, that wasn't leadership, that was obsession. The cracks began to show early in their Sith Empire. Revan wasn't ruling like the Sith of old. He wasn't consumed with pointless displays of cruelty or hollow destruction. His empire had purpose. His war machine was efficient, almost surgical, dismantling the Republic with terrifying precision. Malak didn't understand it. Why negotiate with Sith factions when you can crush them? Why manipulate neutral worlds when you can burn them into submission? To Malak, Revan was wasting time that could be spent conquering faster, ruling harder, and proving to the galaxy that the Sith were supreme. This tension bled into their campaigns. Malak would order unnecessary bombardments. Revan would countermand him, sparing resources, securing long-term control instead of short-term terror. Their arguments became louder, longer, harder to hide from the Sith Lords serving under them. And in those moments, Malak saw his opening. If Revan could be challenged in private, why not in public? If he could question his master's judgment, maybe others would start questioning it too. Malak's ambition was boiling under the surface. He'd tasted what real power felt like, and he wasn't about to let anyone, even his old friend, keep him from the throne. Revan wasn't just stronger, he was better. Every battle plan, Revan's. Every major victory, Revan's. The entire Sith war machine functioned because of Revan's brilliance. To the galaxy, Malak wasn't a co-emperor. He was Revan's shadow, his attack dog, the guy who followed orders, and if there's one thing Malak hated, it was being second. The tension reached a breaking point when whispers of betrayal started circulating through their ranks. Among Sith, betrayal is a love language, so nobody was shocked. He started testing the waters, secret meetings with lords loyal to him, conversations about what a galaxy under his rule would look like. Spoiler, it looked a lot like Revan's galaxy, but with more superweapons and fewer speeches about order and control. Revan noticed, of course. He noticed everything. He confronted Malak more than once, warning him that disobedience would not be tolerated. To Revan, Malak was becoming reckless. They were supposed to be partners, but their philosophies were splitting them apart like a vibroblade through a datapad. And then, you know the story, Malak eventually shows up in the galaxy with that iconic cybernetic prosthetic. During one of their friendly disagreements, Revan decided to make a point. Words weren't enough. Lightsabers came out, and let's just say Malak learned a hard lesson about picking fights with the Dark Lord of the Sith. Revan didn't kill him. He wasn't ready to lose his friend. But the message was clear. Step out of line again, and next time, the head goes with the jaw. You'd think that would end things. Nope. Malak wasn't scared off. He was humiliated. And humiliation festers. That scar was a constant reminder that as long as Revan lived, Malak would never be more than second best. That resentment became obsession. He started plotting, because let's face it, there's no such thing as a peaceful transfer of power in the Sith rulebook. Unknown to Revan, the Jedi Council had been preparing for a desperate strike. They had realized that cutting off the head of the serpent was the only way to end the war. Destroy the Sith Lord, and perhaps the scattered fleets would fall into chaos. They assembled a strike team, led by Jedi Knight Bastila Shan, a young but powerful Jedi, gifted with an extraordinary talent. Through her ability, she could sway the tide of battle, lifting allies and demoralizing enemies. The mission was simple, yet perilous. Infiltrate Revan's flagship and capture him alive. The plan required precision. Bastila's team would slip aboard during a critical fleet engagement, moving through chaos to reach the command deck. But before the Jedi could make their move, another betrayal was already taking shape. Malak had intercepted intelligence of the Council's plan. He could have warned Revan, could have crushed the Jedi ambush before it began. But why would he? For Malak, this was the moment. If the Jedi were targeting Revan, then all Malak had to do was make sure they succeeded, at least enough to remove his master from the equation. Then the mantle of Dark Lord would fall to him, and the Sith Empire would be his alone. The battle began above an unremarkable world deep in the Outer Rim. Republic and Sith fleets clashed in a storm of turbolaser fire and screaming starfighters. Amid the chaos, Bastila's strike team infiltrated Revan's flagship. They carved their way through the corridors, deflecting blaster bolts and cutting down Sith troopers, their lightsabers glowing like shards of sunlight in the darkness. Each step brought them closer to the bridge and closer to destiny. On the command deck, Revan stood calm, as always. The storm raging outside reflected only faintly in his dark mask. He was deep in thought, coordinating maneuvers with deadly precision. Even as alarms blared and reports of boarding parties came in, he remained unshaken. This was a mind that thrived on pressure, a warrior who had stared into the abyss of war and returned stronger for it. But not even Revan foresaw the treachery that would come from the man standing beside him. Malak waited, silent, calculating. He knew the Jedi would reach the bridge soon. He also knew that even a team of elite Jedi could never take Revan alive, unless something drastic shifted the balance. And so, with one quiet command, Malak gave the order to his gunners. Target the bridge. The Sith crew hesitated. Their own Dark Lord was there, but Malak's voice cut through any doubt, sharp and commanding. Moments later, the sky lit up in blinding fire. Turbolaser batteries from Malak's own fleet turned inward, hammering Revan's flagship with relentless fury. Shields flared, buckled, then collapsed under the onslaught. The bridge erupted in explosions, fire and shrapnel tearing through the command deck. Officers screamed as consoles overloaded. Through it all, Revan stood at the center of chaos, until a final blast hurled him across the chamber. The Jedi strike team, already at the threshold of the bridge, surged forward. Smoke and flames obscured their view, but they could sense him, Revan, his presence still towering in the Force, though dimmed and faltering. Bastila moved swiftly, kneeling beside the fallen Sith Lord. His mask lay shattered, fragments glinting on the scorched floor. For the first time in years, his face was bare, a reminder that this monster had once been one of them. Drawing deep on the Force, Bastila reached into Revan's mind. Pain lanced through her, dark and oppressive, but she pushed on, binding him with tendrils of light. Revan stirred, but weakness chained him, his power slipping like sand through his fingers. In that moment, Bastila made a choice that would echo through history. She would save him. While Sith troops reeled from the destruction, and the Republic pressed their advantage, the Jedi carried Revan from the shattered flagship. Malak's fleet pounded the ruins with renewed vigor, determined to erase every trace of what had happened. To the galaxy, it would seem Revan had perished in the fire, struck down in battle like any other warlord. But Malak knew the truth. He had not killed his master, but he had removed him from the throne. And as his forces rallied under his command, Darth Malak, the new Dark Lord of the Sith, prepared to claim the galaxy for himself. What neither Malak nor the Council realized was that this act of betrayal would not end Revan's story. It would only transform it, setting the stage for redemption, revenge, and choices that would shape the fate of the galaxy for centuries to come. Revan was alive, barely. Bastila Shan, her robes torn and her face pale from the strain of the battle, had kept him tethered to life, using the Force. But for all the Council knew, the man lying on that medical bed was still the Dark Lord of the Sith, the architect of the Jedi Civil War, the conqueror of countless worlds, and the destroyer of millions of lives. And now, he was defenseless. So what do you do with a Sith Lord when you've got him unconscious on your operating table? Well, normally the Jedi answer is simple: prison or lightsaber. But this was Revan. And Revan wasn't just any Sith Lord. He was once their greatest knight, their prodigy, the kind of Jedi you quote in lectures to make your students feel inferior. If Revan could fall, anyone could. That's what made the debate so heated. Some members of the Council argued for execution, not out of vengeance but practicality. Revan alive was a threat to the galaxy. If he regained consciousness as the Dark Lord, they'd be right back where they started, or worse. Others pushed for imprisonment. Lock him up on some far-flung moon, feed him nutrient paste, and pray he didn't figure out how to force choke his way out. Bastila had another idea, a wild one. She believed that the Force itself, yes, the Force, had put Revan in their hands for a reason, that maybe this was an opportunity for redemption. After all, she'd seen something during their duel, a glimpse, a flicker of the man he used to be, and Bastila Shan was never one to waste a flicker. And so the plan formed. They wouldn't kill Revan, they wouldn't lock him away, they would reprogram him. That's where things got ethically messy. The Jedi Council decided to do something unprecedented: erase his memories, strip away everything, his name, his crimes, his ambitions, until all that remained was a shell. Into that shell they would implant a new identity, a loyal servant of the Republic. The logic? If Revan's tactical genius had nearly destroyed the galaxy, maybe that same brilliance could save it, if pointed in the right direction. Sounds simple, right? Just mind-wipe the most dangerous man in the galaxy and hope it doesn't backfire. Except the Jedi Council isn't a bunch of Sith. They had to justify it. They had to twist themselves into philosophical pretzels, trying to explain why violating someone's free will was okay this one time. Cue the debates. In the end, survival won out over philosophy. The Council voted, reluctantly, to proceed, but they swore it was temporary. Once the Mandalorian Wars were a memory, once the Republic was stable again, they'd revisit the question. Spoiler, they never did. Jedi are great at many things. Follow-up isn't one of them. So they gathered in the chamber, the air heavy with the hum of the Force. Revan was laid out on the table, his breath shallow, his mind shattered from Bastila's battle meditation. And then the ritual began. A delicate weaving of thought and power, cutting away memories like rotten branches while trying not to kill the tree. His triumphs, his failures, his name. In their place, a blank slate. Well, mostly blank. You can't fully erase someone like Revan. Too much personality, too much Revanness. Think of it like deleting files from a datapad. You might clear the folders, but some of those fragments linger in the system, waiting for the right trigger. And oh, would those fragments matter later? When the ritual was over, the Council stepped back and looked at their work. There he was, no longer Darth Revan, Scourge of the Galaxy, a man, sleeping peacefully, unaware that his very identity had been rewritten by the people who once called him friend. Was it the right choice? To this day, Jedi historians argue about it. Was it justice? Or was it hubris? The same kind of hubris that let Revan fall in the first place. Hard to say. All anyone knew for sure was that the fate of the galaxy now hinged on one of the strangest gambits in Jedi history. And Bastila Shan? She had just volunteered to keep an eye on this new Republic hero and make sure he didn't accidentally remember he was once the most terrifying Sith Lord in the galaxy. Easy job, right? What could possibly go wrong? The first weeks were interesting. Revan was cooperative, competent, and astonishingly adaptive. He soaked in training, demonstrated an uncanny ability to grasp tactics, and instinctively understood leadership. traits the Council hadn't fully anticipated would persist without memory. It was almost eerie. You could see it in the way he assessed a room, how he organized drills, or even the subtle authority he carried without realizing it. Bastila often found herself reminding herself, yes, he's a blank slate, but maybe not really. She introduced him to the Republic way of life, focusing on values the Council deemed important: loyalty, discipline, and service to the greater good. Every mission, every tactical simulation, every interaction with Jedi instructors was carefully curated. The goal was to channel his genius in a constructive direction without triggering memories of conquest, betrayal, or the seductive pull of the dark side. In a way, it was like walking a tightrope across a stormy galaxy, and one misstep could send him, and possibly the Republic, plummeting into chaos. Interestingly, the more Revan learned, the more natural it seemed to him. Leadership wasn't taught, it emerged. He didn't remember commanding fleets, but he instinctively organized troops, made tactical decisions, and even predicted enemy maneuvers with uncanny accuracy. Bastila noticed this constantly. It was both a blessing and a source of tension. She knew that the man in front of her was still capable of things the galaxy wasn't ready for, yet she also understood that the right guidance could turn that potential into a powerful asset for the Republic. Bastila had to engage with him, challenge him, even scold him occasionally, as if he were a particularly bright but stubborn student. She had to balance respect and authority carefully, maintaining her own credibility while guiding someone who, under different circumstances, could have been her adversary. At times, the strain was intense. Revan's instincts sometimes ran ahead of his conscious understanding, and every hint of hesitation or curiosity about his past could create subtle ripples she needed to manage. And then there were the small human moments. Revan learning humor, camaraderie, and empathy little by little. He didn't remember the horrors he had committed, nor the victories he had orchestrated, but he began forming bonds, laughing at jokes and responding to people in ways that built trust. These weren't just exercises in morale. Of course, there were subtle echoes of the past. Occasionally, a flicker of intuition, a moment of foresight, or an instinctive decision would hint at the depth of Revan's former self. Bastila watched these moments closely. They were small, often imperceptible to anyone else, but they told her that the core of the man, the brilliance, the strategic genius, the connection to the Force, hadn't been erased. It was dormant, lying beneath the surface like coals beneath ash. She couldn't ignite it, but she had to ensure it didn't spark prematurely, especially with Malak and the Sith Empire still out there. As Revan trained and undertook missions for the Republic, a new identity began to solidify. He was no longer Darth Revan, the Sith Emperor. He was a soldier, a leader in training, a man who could wield the Force and the mind's power without remembering the terrible weight of his past. The galaxy began to see him as a promising hero, though few suspected the silent storm of potential lying beneath his calm exterior. Bastila, meanwhile, became both mentor and guardian, guiding him through the daily challenges of his new life while constantly aware of the fragile balance she maintained. It was a delicate, tense, and fascinating process. Every choice, every lesson, every mission had layers of meaning. Bastila's guidance ensured that Revan could contribute to the Republic while remaining contained, and slowly, inevitably, a soldier emerged, competent, confident, and unaware of the power he had once wielded. Yet the Force, as always, kept whispers alive. Somewhere beneath his blank slate, the old Revan, Sith, strategist, and hero, was waiting, his essence intact, ready to resurface when the time came. By the end of this period, Republic soldier Revan, he was a man in his own right, forming relationships, proving his abilities, and growing into the role he had been given. But every step forward carried the unspoken tension. The man he had been, the genius of Darth Revan, had not disappeared. He was contained, yes, but not gone. And that quiet potential, the spark of what he could become, was a constant presence, hovering just below the surface, waiting for the day it might awaken again. The war raged on. Darth Malak, once the loyal apprentice, now the self-proclaimed Dark Lord, continued the campaign Revan began. Fleets of Sith warships scorched world after world, striking deeper into the core. With Revan gone, Malak had no leash, no restraint, only hunger for domination. The Republic needed a savior, so the Jedi gave them one. The Jedi understood Revan's genius was their best hope to end the war. Stripped of memories, he could still think, adapt, lead. Traits that didn't vanish with his past. They believed this reborn Revan could be steered toward redemption without ever knowing how far he had fallen. But war doesn't wait for second chances. Revan's new life began in fire. The Endar Spire fell under attack by Malak's forces. Malak had learned Bastilla's location, and he knew that without the Jedi who had toppled Revan, the Republic would collapse even faster. Explosions ripped through the corridors as Sith boarding parties clashed with Republic defenders. Among the chaos, Revan, clueless about his true self, fought for survival. Alongside a Republic officer named Carth Onasi, Revan escaped the doomed vessel and crash-landed on the Ecumenopolis of Taris. Losing Revan to the Sith would undo everything. For Revan, it was the beginning of something he didn't yet understand. On Taris, life became a grind of narrow escapes and improvised alliances. Revan, unaware that he had once commanded legions, scraped by as a fugitive in the planet's undercity, hunting for leads on Bastilla, who had been captured during the chaos. Every decision he made during those days seemed like chance, but the Force whispered through him, nudging him towards survival and victory. When he fought, there was precision in his movements, an edge no common soldier possessed. Carth noticed it. So did Bastilla when they finally reunited. Their journey off Taris marked a turning point. The Republic had little time left, and the Jedi Council saw an opportunity they couldn't ignore. They dispatched Revan, Carth, Bastilla, and a ragtag crew aboard the Ebon Hawk to track down an ancient Sith superweapon, the Starforge. It was the heart of Malak's war machine, the reason the Sith could replace fleets faster than the Republic could destroy them. The only way to end the war was to find it and shut it down. The knowledge they needed was locked inside Revan's own mind. He didn't remember it, not fully, but echoes remained. Dreams, visions, flashes of worlds bathed in red sunlight, and ruins that hummed with power. The Jedi didn't tell him why these visions mattered. They only said this: follow them, find the star maps, piece together the path to the Forge. And so the hunt began. Each world they visited, Dantooine, Kashyyyk, Tatooine, Manaan, Korriban, pulled Revan closer to the truth. Each star map was like a fragment of a shattered mirror, reflecting pieces of a life he didn't recognize. Conversations with Bastilla grew tense. She pushed him to trust the Jedi, to obey without question. Yet even she couldn't deny the bond forming between them. A bond the Council feared, a bond that echoed something older, something dangerous. What made it more haunting was this: Revan wasn't becoming a new person. He was circling back to who he had always been. Every decision, every choice on that journey carried weight. Would he reclaim his past and embrace the darkness that had once consumed him? Or would he forge a new path, one truly his own? The Jedi had gambled everything by rewriting Revan's identity. But the cracks were already forming, and as the Ebon Hawk jumped from system to system, chasing fragments of an ancient map, no one realized how close the truth really was, or how devastating it would be when Revan finally remembered who he was. The galaxy thought it needed a hero. What it got was a man standing at the crossroads of light and shadow, guided by choices that would shape the fate of millions. The moment of revelation arrived suddenly, aboard the Leviathan, a trap laid by Admiral Saul Karath, closed with merciless precision. Revan and his crew were caught off guard, their options limited. Malak's presence in the command chamber turned a tactical failure into a reckoning. When the Dark Lord spoke, his words were simple but deadly precise. The name detonated in Revan's mind, like a thermal charge igniting buried explosives. Memories he didn't know he still carried surged forward. The Mandalorian Wars, the bloody campaigns across Dxon and Malachor 5, the moment he and Malak knelt before the unseen power of the Sith Emperor, the Starforge, the conquest of the core worlds, all of it, rushing back in a torrent of clarity and horror. He remembered the strategies, the victories, the atrocities committed in the name of his vision. Every system taken, every life extinguished under his command, flashed in vivid detail. And with that clarity came understanding. He had been manipulated, controlled, and yet he had also chosen. Every choice had been his, even when the Jedi tried to erase him. But these memories didn't come unaccompanied. Alongside them was the life he had lived since awakening on the Endar Spire, the companions he had grown to trust, the battles fought to save systems rather than conquer them, the quiet moments of friendship and camaraderie aboard the Ebon Hawk. The two lives collided violently in his mind, creating a storm of guilt, pride, doubt, and resolve. He was both the Dark Lord of the Sith and the man who had walked as a Republic soldier, a hero of the galaxy. Malak's smug presence only heightened the impact. He revelled in the revelation, each word and glance designed to tear at Revan's newly reclaimed identity. You were theirs, a pawn in their misguided crusade, and yet here you are, remembering all of it. The realization was immediate. The Jedi had lied, Bastila had been manipulated, and the war he had fought for and against was built on layers of deception. The Force had pulled at him, guiding him not merely to the Starforge, but to the truth of who he was, unmasking the puppet strings that had bound him. He understood now that every star map collected, every mission undertaken, had been a breadcrumb trail leading him back to himself. The truth brought with it a dangerous clarity. Revan knew that to continue as he had been, a soldier following the Jedi Council's directives, would be impossible. He was no longer simply Revan the amnesiac hero. He was Revan, the strategist, the Dark Lord, the one who had both destroyed and built empires, and now, armed with memory and insight, he had the knowledge to confront Malak, to reclaim the galaxy from the chaos he had helped unleash, or to follow the path the dark side had once promised. The crew of the Ebon Hawk sensed the shift instantly. Revan's demeanour, the subtle steel in his gaze, the way his mind seemed to calculate, anticipate, and perceive at a speed they had never witnessed. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. The balance of power had shifted, and the galaxy itself seemed to pause, waiting for the storm Revan now embodied to strike. This was the point of no return. He remembered, he understood, and in that understanding lay the seed of a reckoning that would change everything: friendships, loyalties, and the fate of the Republic itself. The Dark Lord of the Sith and the Republic's amnesiac hero were one again, a force unbound and unpredictable, ready to shape the galaxy in ways no one could yet imagine. The culmination of years of planning, maneuvering, and warfare came down to this moment. Revan, restored to full memory, an understanding of both his past and the weight of the galaxy, stood at the precipice of what would be the final confrontation with Malak. Revan, no longer a nameless soldier, no longer a pawn of the Jedi Council, stepped into its shadow, fully aware of who he was. Every fragment of his past had returned: the Jedi Knight, the war hero, the Dark Lord, yet he carried them not as chains, but as truths. The galaxy had tried to force him into a single mold: Jedi savior, Sith tyrant. But here, on the threshold of destiny, he chose to be something else entirely. The Starforge erupted into chaos as Republic and Sith fleets clashed in orbit. Boarding parties flooded its corridors, and the air was thick with the clash of blades and the stench of fire. Malak was waiting. He'd prepared for this moment, both strategically and emotionally. He believed he had surpassed his old friend and master. Where Revan was cunning, Malak was raw, brutal power. Where Revan wove plans, Malak tore obstacles apart. The galaxy would bend under his strength, and when Revan walked into that chamber, he was defending the very idea that betrayal had made him greater. Malak's opening strikes were savage, powered by anger and an endless reservoir of energy drawn from the forge. Sparks exploded as their blades collided, echoing against walls filled with machinery older than the Republic itself. Malak taunted him, reminding Revan of the atrocities he had committed, of the armies he had led, of the darkness he had once embraced. He wanted to pull him back into that abyss, to prove that nothing had really changed. But this time, something was different. Revan didn't fight with the single, rigid discipline of the Jedi. He didn't fight with the furious abandon of the Sith either. His movements flowed, adapting, bending, drawing from both traditions, but belonging fully to neither. One blade burned red, a relic of his Sith reign. The other glowed purple, a rare crystal that spoke of balance, of walking the line between light and darkness. Together, they were a statement. Revan had embraced his past without being chained to it. He could carry the memory of Darth Revan and the ideals of the Jedi Knight, and forge something new in between. Malak sneered, but there was a flicker of doubt. For all his bravado, he had always lived in Revan's shadow. He had followed him into war, into darkness, and finally into betrayal. Now, seeing his old master wield both legacies at once, he couldn't shake the sense that Revan had reached a strength he could never touch. The strength to reconcile contradictions instead of being consumed by them. The fight raged through the chamber, blades cutting through the air in arcs of crimson and violet light. Malak hurled debris, lightning, and raw fury. Revan answered with precision, adaptability, and that uncanny clarity that came from knowing exactly who he was. Neither Jedi nor Sith, but something greater than both. Around them, Malak had prepared a grotesque advantage. The captive Jedi he had bound to life support machines, drained of their power to feed his strength. Whenever he faltered, he drew on their agony to rise again, a vampire clinging to stolen vitality. It was a horror, even by Sith standards, and Malak revelled in the cruelty. But Revan cut through it, literally and symbolically. One by one, he destroyed the machines, freeing the captives from their torment and stripping Malak of his borrowed energy. Each strike was more than a tactical move. It was a rejection of Malak's vision. The Force was not a reservoir to be drained dry. It was a living current, and Revan chose to flow with it, not enslave it. With every step, Malak grew more desperate. His words shifted from mockery to pleading, from arrogance to bitterness. He accused Revan of weakness, of betrayal, of hypocrisy. He demanded to know how his old master could claim victory when he had once fallen so far. But Revan's silence said more than words. His actions were the answer. At last, Malak faltered, his strength bleeding out as his crutches failed. Their blades clashed one final time, the red and purple sabers pressing against his crimson weapon until it shattered. Malak staggered, defeated, and the dark energy that had sustained him flickered out like a dying flame. On the floor of the Starforge, Malak faced the truth he had always feared. He had believed betrayal made him stronger, that casting aside bonds freed him. But Revan had shown the opposite. Strength came from memory, from connection, from carrying both failure and triumph into the future. Malak's last words carried a strange respect, even regret. For all his hatred, he admitted that Revan had always been the stronger one. The aftermath was not immediate celebration. The Starforge was destroyed, but the galaxy was far from safe. Revan and the surviving Jedi and Republic forces worked quickly to stabilize the core worlds, but news of the Sith's existence beyond the unknown regions lingered like a shadow. Revan, having regained his full memory, understood the magnitude of the threat that had manipulated him and Malak, the Sith Emperor Vitiate, whose reach extended even into the depths of the unknown regions. Bastila Shan remained at his side, her presence a reminder of both the personal and strategic bonds formed through the conflict. She had believed in Revan's redemption even when the Council had doubts, and her trust had been vindicated. Together, they began to contemplate how to guide the Republic toward lasting stability while preparing for the challenges that still waited in the shadows. He now recognized that neither strict adherence to the Jedi Code nor the embrace of Sith ambition alone could bring balance. Wisdom, pragmatism, and the courage to confront moral ambiguity were equally necessary. In choosing to walk this path, he became something rare, a Force user capable of understanding both sides without succumbing fully to either. And yet, despite this newfound clarity, Revan knew that the galaxy would remember him in many ways. To some, he would always be a savior, the man who defeated Malak and dismantled the Starforge. To others, he would be a cautionary tale, a reminder that even heroes could fall and that absolute power always left scars. Revan accepted both truths. Redemption, he realized, was as much about reconciling with one's own conscience as it was about earning forgiveness from others. In the weeks that followed, Revan assisted in reorganizing the Republic's military, advising on tactics that balanced strategic aggression with restraint. His knowledge of both Jedi and Sith methods made him an invaluable resource, and his presence alone inspired loyalty among soldiers and commanders alike. Yet he remained acutely aware that peace was fragile, and that the galaxy would always contain forces beyond immediate control. And as the Starforge crumbled behind him, Revan looked toward the stars, understanding that his story was far from over. Power, temptation, and the unknown would always exist, but so too would choice. and Revan had proven that even the darkest past could be reconciled with hope, wisdom, and the courage to act rightly when it mattered most. Yet Revan felt the pull, a call that could not be ignored. He understood that to truly secure the galaxy's future, he would have to confront the source of the darkness he had glimpsed. Leaving Bastila behind meant abandoning a partner, someone who had become more than a comrade, a friend, perhaps even something closer. But the galaxy's safety demanded sacrifice, and Revan had spent much of his life understanding the weight of difficult decisions. He could not allow attachment to sway him from the path that might prevent another galaxy-wide catastrophe. And so, Revan disappeared into the void beyond the known galaxy, a lone sentinel against a threat few even knew existed. Behind him, Bastila remained, the embodiment of the Republic's enduring hope. His story was far from over, yet for the first time, he acted not out of ambition or vengeance, but out of true responsibility, an understanding that power alone was not enough, and that the path of redemption often required walking alone. The Emperor's influence radiated like a dark tide through the void, touching every hidden fortress, every abandoned stronghold, every corrupted soul daring to claim power in his name. Revan understood immediately that confronting this foe would demand subtlety, patience, and the careful application of all he had learned as Jedi and Sith alike. Infiltration became his strategy. Revan disguised his intentions, presenting himself to the scattered remnants of the Sith as a loyal disciple, a would-be apprentice seeking to master the Emperor's teachings. His Starforge campaigns, his mastery of the Force, and even his Sith past became tools in this deception. To outsiders, he appeared to embrace the dark, but beneath the mask, his mind churned with plans and contingencies. Every word, every gesture was calculated, every decision a test to measure the Emperor's defenses and identify weaknesses. At first, progress seemed promising. Revan gained access to the inner sanctums of Sith power, observing the mechanics of an empire maintained not by fleets alone, but by fear, corruption, and the meticulous manipulation of loyalty. He mapped the Emperor's command network, studied the rituals that sustained ancient Sith energies, and assessed the dark arts that anchored Vitiate's immortality. In these first months, Revan was a shadow walking among shadows, an actor performing a role with flawless precision. Yet Vitiate was no fool. The Emperor's awareness of the Force extended beyond the limits of ordinary perception, reaching into intentions, motives, and the faintest currents of ambition. Revan's attempts at deception, no matter how subtle, eventually drew attention. The Emperor's probing revealed inconsistencies, not overt mistakes, but subtle tremors in Revan's aura, a flicker of defiance, a trace of independent thought, a spark of resistance. These were enough. The betrayal of subtlety came swiftly. Revan's guise was shattered, and the Emperor's forces struck with precision and cruelty. Revan was captured, restrained by chains forged in the dark side, and cast into an oubliette designed not only to hold the body, but to imprison the mind itself. The Emperor's imprisonment was a work of both science and sorcery, a fusion of ancient Sith ritual and unimaginable Force application. Revan's consciousness was isolated, subjected to endless cycles of torment and indoctrination, designed to strip away identity and will. For decades, centuries, the galaxy beyond continued. But within that chamber, time became meaningless. Every thought, every memory, every shred of autonomy was tested, broken, and remade. Yet Revan endured. His resilience was not invincibility, but a quiet, relentless resistance, a refusal to allow the Emperor complete dominion over his mind. 3 centuries passed in this state, a span that saw stars born and die, civilizations rise and fall, and empires fade into myth. During this time, Revan's mind oscillated between lucidity and imprisonment, moments of awareness interspersed with endless psychological trials. He was forced to confront every possible aspect of his identity: Jedi, Sith, hero, villain, conqueror, redeemer. Each fragment of self was examined, judged, and challenged. Vitiate sought to shape him into the perfect instrument, a puppet whose intellect, skill, and ambition would serve the Emperor's vision without question. Yet within this relentless captivity, Revan's inner strength did not vanish. He learned to navigate the labyrinth of manipulation, to find spaces in which the Emperor's influence faltered, to hold on to fragments of memory and strategy. In some moments, he rehearsed freedom in his mind, plotting the weaknesses in the dark constructs, memorizing the rhythms of his imprisonment, and preparing for the faintest opportunity to turn the chains against his captor. The galaxy outside had largely forgotten him. Legends of Darth Revan were now stories for scholars, warnings for the curious, and myths whispered by those who studied the Sith. Yet in the void of imprisonment, Revan became more than memory or legend. He became a mind tempered by centuries of exposure to the darkest of powers, sharpened by isolation, and honed by the necessity of survival against a being who could consume entire worlds. The opportunity came unexpectedly. The Emperor, in his hubris, had allowed a moment of imbalance, an anomaly in the vast web of the force he controlled. Revan sensed it as a whisper at first, a subtle weakness in the psychic chains that bound him. Through centuries of observation, he had learned the Emperor's methods, the rhythm of his control, the predictable arrogance of a being who believed he was eternal. Patiently, silently, he began to maneuver within the prison of his own mind, exploiting tiny gaps, bending shadows, weaving illusions that the Emperor could not detect. When the moment finally arrived, Revan used the Force itself as a key, untangling centuries of psychic shackles with the precision of a master strategist. When Revan emerged from captivity, it was his dark side who took control. The light side of his spirit was left behind, a ghost-like echo lingering outside the physical realm, unable to fully manifest. He struck at the threads the Emperor had woven, tearing apart the illusionary prison, collapsing centuries of meticulous control into a single, devastating unraveling. Whole enough to act, fractured enough to be unpredictable, and armed with knowledge that had been forged in the fire of centuries. Revan's first act was not vengeance, though it burned in him like coals ready to ignite. It was assessment. He reconstructed the galaxy in his mind, mapping the empires, the alliances, and the remnants of the Sith. He discovered the hidden enclaves, the secret strongholds, and the relics of power left to decay over centuries. The Emperor's reach had grown, but so had Revan's understanding. The galaxy had forgotten him, but he had not forgotten it. Every weakness, every blind spot, every subtle flaw in the Emperor's rule became a target in his mind. From the shadows, he began to move. Revan rebuilt his network, reaching out to those who still remembered the old ways, the Force-sensitive exiles, and the scattered remnants of Jedi and Sith alike. He studied the lingering threats, analysed the balance of power, and carefully reconstructed the strategy that had once made him a legend. The Rakatan Foundry, a relic of ancient technology capable of building armies of staggering scale, became his first target. Here, he would create the tools necessary to challenge the Emperor and purge the galaxy of Sith corruption in one decisive stroke. He moved with precision, using deception, foresight, and patience as his allies. Every droid, every starship, every hidden cache of knowledge was assessed, assimilated, and put to use. Yet beneath the tactical brilliance, there was something darker, the lingering residue of the Emperor's torment, a drive toward finality, toward absolute control. The galaxy had suffered under the Emperor's shadow for centuries, and Revan's vision now extended to a galaxy cleansed of Sith influence by whatever means necessary. The first confrontations were swift. Imperial remnants, unaware of his return, fell to meticulously planned strikes. Sith descendants, scattered and arrogant, were outmaneuvered. His understanding of the Force, honed through centuries of psychic imprisonment, allowed him to anticipate attacks, manipulate minds, and dominate engagements without revealing his full power. Each victory was a step toward confronting the Emperor himself, a being whose centuries-long patience had been challenged at last. Yet Revan did not act blindly. He knew the dangers of overreach, the thin line between savior and tyrant. The trauma of 300 years of torment had taught him patience, caution, and subtlety. His vision was vast, spanning fleets, worlds, and generations. The galaxy was his chessboard, the pieces both powerful and dangerous. And at the center of it all was the one adversary who had once held him prisoner, the Sith Emperor. Every move, every campaign, every strike brought Revan closer to the inevitable reckoning, the confrontation that would determine the fate of the galaxy itself. Revan's saga stretching across centuries of war, imprisonment, and cosmic manipulation, reached its ultimate climax on Yavin 4. He would confront the Emperor and end the source of his torment permanently, no matter the cost. The jungle moon became a war zone. The Order of Revan, disciplined and fanatical, clashed with Republic troopers and Sith warriors alike. In the skies above, warships fought for control, streaks of turbolaser fire illuminating the night. On the ground, among the towering Masasi temples, Revan's strategies unfolded with terrifying brilliance, striking and retreating with devastating coordination. At the heart of it all stood Revan himself. Dark Revan, cloaked in power and conviction, wielded the Force with overwhelming might. To those who opposed him, he seemed unstoppable. Lightning crashed from his hands, barriers of energy deflected blaster fire and saber strikes, and every motion of his blade carried the weight of centuries of combat mastery. But the alliance arrayed against him was vast and unyielding. Jedi Masters and Sith Lords coordinated their attacks, soldiers and smugglers lent their strength, and strike teams pierced deeper into the temple complex. Despite his might, Revan began to falter. And then, at the most critical moment, another presence emerged. The light side Revan, the echo of the man he once was. This Revan was not flesh and blood, but spirit, a luminous apparition who carried the wisdom, compassion, and balance that had been lost to centuries of hatred. He confronted his darker half. For all his power, Dark Revan was incomplete. His fury, his will, his endless determination could not overcome the opposition before him. He needed the part of himself that he had long rejected. The confrontation was not one of lightsabers or lightning, but of identity. The two halves of Revan, light and dark, Jedi and Sith, prisoner and conqueror, faced one another. Around them, the battle slowed, as allies and enemies alike sensed the shift. What unfolded was no longer just a fight for survival or victory. It was the culmination of Revan's entire existence, and in that moment the truth became clear. Revan could not continue divided. The light and dark were not enemies to be destroyed, but halves of the same soul, inseparable and essential. To deny one was to deny himself. With that realization, the two halves reconciled. Revan became whole once more. The unification brought peace to his fractured spirit. The rage that had consumed him for so long gave way to clarity. His endless crusade against the Emperor, driven by vengeance, by desperation, by the scars of centuries, was at last understood for what it was: futile. The Emperor could not be destroyed by hate alone. Revan's path had always been flawed, because it had always been incomplete. Now, at last, he was balanced. The armies surrounding him felt it instantly. The oppressive aura of fury lifted. The man before them was no longer the unrelenting warlord, nor the broken prisoner, nor the fallen Jedi. He was all of these, and more. For the first time since his capture by the Emperor, centuries earlier, Revan was truly himself. But the reunion came with a cost. His body, long sustained by sheer will and the unnatural power of his division, could endure no longer. As his spirit healed, the flesh gave way. The mortal frame of Revan, exhausted by centuries of torment, imprisonment, and battle, collapsed. Yet this was no defeat. Revan did not die in despair or in rage. He did not fall to an enemy's blade, nor to the Emperor's will. He let go, willingly and peacefully, surrendering himself to the Force. His essence became one with it, luminous and whole. The Emperor endured, still a looming threat, but Revan's journey had ended. The galaxy remembered Revan in many ways. To the Jedi, he was both a prodigy and a warning. He had been their greatest student, a mind of unparalleled brilliance, capable of extraordinary feats of diplomacy, strategy, and combat. And yet he had fallen so far, succumbing to the allure of power and ambition, orchestrating wars that had cost countless lives. His rise and fall became a subject of study within the Jedi Temple, a complex lesson in the dangers of pride, attachment, and moral certainty. Masters would cite his victories as examples of tactical genius and his betrayals as stark reminders that even the most trusted could stray into darkness. For the Sith, Revan's legacy was equally profound. He demonstrated the possibilities and the risks of ambition unrestrained. Darth Revan's life showed that the boundaries between light and dark were not absolute. that a Sith could possess strategy and restraint, and that the Force was a tool of infinite subtlety, capable of shaping both destiny and ideology. Even centuries later, Sith apprentices studied his campaigns across the core worlds, his use of the Starforge, and his manipulation of alliances as a blueprint for power. Revan's story became a standard against which all Sith measured their own ambition, for his success was undeniable, but so too was the price he paid. Beyond the orders and armies, Revan's influence seeped into the hearts and minds of ordinary beings. Planets scarred by his wars rebuilt with caution, teaching generations about resilience and the fragility of security. Historians debated his actions endlessly, weighing morality against necessity, conquest against survival. Some saw him as a tyrant, a destroyer of worlds, while others regarded him as a hero, a protector who had once wielded unimaginable power to confront a greater evil. In truth, he was both, an embodiment of duality, reminding all who studied him that history is rarely composed of absolutes. Revan's influence was especially notable in the ongoing conflict between the Republic and remnants of the Sith Empire. Even after his death, the systems he had conquered, the alliances he had forged, and the enemies he had made all bore the mark of his strategy. In the end, Darth Revan's name became legend. Across the galaxy, stories of his campaigns, his fall, and his redemption were told to children, debated by scholars, and pondered by Force users of all kinds. He had changed the galaxy irrevocably, not merely through conquest or war, but by leaving a template of complexity, ambition, and morality that would challenge every generation to come. His spirit, light, dark, and everything in between, continued to echo in the Force, a reminder that the galaxy's destiny was never simple, and that the choices of one extraordinary individual could ripple across time and space, shaping history itself. Artifacts tied to Revan became objects of obsession. From his mask, worn during the Mandalorian Wars, to holocrons encoded with his philosophies, seekers of power scoured the galaxy for any fragment of his teachings. Entire cults and shadowy sects arose, calling themselves the Revanites, devoted not to the Jedi Code or the Sith Code, but to Revan's belief that truth lies somewhere between the two. These followers argued that light and dark were tools, not destinies, a dangerous idea that would ripple far beyond their time. Revan's life was a story of extremes. His mask still lies somewhere out there, hidden in the shadows of forgotten worlds, waiting for the next seeker who dares to ask the same question that defined him. What does it truly mean to bring balance to the Force?